everybody for coming. We're honored today at CAC to welcome Cristina Mendoza, Professor of Music. And Cristina is going to share with us her dissertation research, and her title is Karel Husa's Apotheosis of this Earth, Man's Destruction of the Planet in 3 Movements.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. This has fortunately been the impetus for me getting back into my document writing. I'm a DMA candidate in instrumental conducting at the University of Houston, and the only thing I have to do to finish is to write my document and defend it, and then I can be Dr. Cristina. But getting to that point has been a little bit of a trial, and so I found that getting back into my topic has been very useful. So you may be wondering about the rather stark tone of my title, and so let me begin by referring you to the composer's program note, which is as follows. The composition of Apotheosis of this Earth was motivated by the present desperate stage of mankind and its immense problems with everyday killings, war, hunger, extermination of fauna, huge forest fires, and critical contamination of the whole environment. Man's brutal possession and misuse of nature's beauty, if continued at today's reckless speed, can only lead to catastrophe. The composer hopes that the destruction of this beautiful earth can be stopped, so that the tragedy of destruction, musically projected here in the second movement, and the desolation of its aftermath, the postscript of the third movement, can exist only as fantasy, never to become reality. And at 27 minutes, I regret that I can't present the entire work today, but I hope that you'll become curious enough to listen to a recording later with a better understanding of the work and its background. It's just fascinating. So the first movement of the work is entitled Apotheosis. And continuing from the program notes, in the first movement, Apotheosis, the Earth first appears as a point of light in the universe. Our memory and imagination approach it in perhaps the same way as it appeared to the astronauts returning from the moon. The Earth grows larger and larger, and we can even remember some of its tragic moments as struck by the xylophone near the end of the movement. The second movement, Tragedy of Destruction, deals with the actual brutalities of man against nature, leading to the destruction of our planet, perhaps by radioactive explosion. The Earth dies as a savagely, mortally wounded creature. The last movement is a postscript, full of the realization that so little is left to be said. The Earth has been pulverized into the universe, the voices scattered into space. Toward the end, these voices, at first computer-like and mechanical, unite into the words, "This beautiful Earth," simply said, warm and filled with regret, and one of so many questions comes to our minds: why have we let it happen? Karel Husa wrote these words in October of 1970 as he completed his piece, and it's a chilling description of his music as well as his own views of the world around him. But it could have been written today about the concerns that many of us share for the future and the present of our planet. So with such a stark topic, why would one choose a work like this for one's doctoral research? And there are a few reasons, one of which was that I was looking for a piece that I was more or less unfamiliar with, but important in the wind band repertoire, to write a thorough conductor's guide, a rehearsal guide, a performance guide, through the lens of the teaching approach, pedagogical approach that we use at the University of Houston in our instrumental ensemble program. And that philosophy is based on the teaching of Eddie Green, who's a well-known music educator with roots in Texas. Apotheosis was one of several works on a list of possibilities that my mentor and I compiled. And the composer was familiar to me enough, but not that work. It's a work that isn't written about as much as some of his others. Many of the other works on my list were dismissed outright because they had already been examined in dissertations by several other contemporary authors, and fairly recently, so there was really no need to rewrite what had just been done. And with Apotheosis, as I was discovering, I found that it was mentioned only briefly in writings about his other works. but no one had actually taken the time to do what I intended to do, which was a complete guide for performance. And so as I looked through the score, it became clear that it was going to be a real challenge for me as a conductor and as a writer, and it would push me to understand and appreciate more contemporary wind band literature. And so since my preference is for the powerful, but yet the melodic, this would definitely be something to challenge my ear, and the listener is hard-pressed to leave the performance hall with a melody in his or her ear. Here's Professor Husa in some recent photos. He was born in 1921 in Czechoslovakia, and he lives today in North Carolina. He's still living, and it's my hope that I'll be able to meet with him either in person or through other means real soon, so that I can get some of his possibly final words on his writing. His parents expected him to go to school for engineering or for law. Music was important to him, but it was a hobby. But right after he graduated from high school, the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia and closed down most of the universities, in other words, the technical and trade schools in the late 1930s. And so he found an opportunity to enroll in music school. And with just his basic music training, he placed into the second-year composition class. And fortunately for him and for us, this allowed him to remain in the music school. Those schools were not closed down by the invading Germans. They were allowed to maintain. And his enrollment there kept him from being conscripted into an ammunition factory in Germany. So just a set of random chances kept him out of wartime and left him to compose for us even to today. He was quite a successful student. He earned a fellowship to study in Paris, and he became a student of Nadia Boulanger and Arthur Honegger, and did quite well with his fellowship, and he was expected to return to Czechoslovakia, but by that time it was pretty apparent that if he went back, he would never be allowed probably to leave again. And so he relinquished his citizenship and remained in Paris and continued to write and study there, and became known as a conductor as well as a composer. In the 50s, he was invited by Donald Grout, an important music historian, musicologist, to come to the United States, to Cornell University, and be a member of their faculty. And so he arrived in 1954, he became a U.S. citizen in 1959, and conducted the Cornell Orchestra until the mid-1970s, and remained on their faculty, in fact, until 1992. He's composed for orchestra, for wind band, for piano, chamber ensemble, a ballet, a variety of different genres of music, and his wind band works are now becoming more well-known, but in the early part of his career were not what he was mostly recognized for. The first time he tried to write for any kind of wind instruments was with his Divertimento in 1958, and his first piece for concert band, for wind band, was his Music for Prague 1968. This is the work that people know Karel Husa by, especially in the wind band world. He was inspired to write the piece during the time that Czechoslovakia was being invaded by the Soviets, in a time that was known as the Prague Spring. So poor Czechoslovakia just keeps getting overrun by everybody. But this one in particular was very meaningful to him. He watched the events unfold from far away. He still had not been back to Czechoslovakia at that time. It's a nationalist work. It's very symbolic. He uses some old Hussite hymns as the basis for his melodies. And it's a very popular wind band work. In fact, it's been performed more than 8,000 times since its premiere in 1969. And then his third work, the one that I'm concerned with, is Apotheosis of this Earth, which he composed in 1970. Apotheosis was also very popular at its outset. It received about 80 performances within the first two years of its premiere. But for reasons that you'll shortly see, it became more and more difficult to program and to perform. He's had several other wind band pieces since Apotheosis as well, and he remains a popular composer in that area. The piece itself was commissioned by the Michigan School Band and Orchestra Association for the occasion of the retirement of Professor William D. Ravelli, the director of bands at the University of Michigan. And Ravelli, if you don't know the name, was a famed conductor, music educator in the 1950s and 60s, both revered and feared by bandsmen everywhere. And he set the standard for school, college, university band programs that still maintains today. And of course, we know that the Michigan School of Music is wonderful, as well as the Michigan Marching Band is very well renowned, and it's mostly much thanks to Professor Ravelli and those who came after him. At the time that he was commissioned, though, he was noticing some changes in his own environment, Husa was. He had a summer cottage on Lake Cayuga in upstate New York near Ithaca, where he was teaching. And as he was beginning to work on the commission for Michigan, he started to notice some very disturbing scenes near this summer cottage. And he said, "I saw an incredible number of dead fish floating on Lake Cayuga near the cottage. The new power plant was producing hot water that caused thermal pollution, which in turn killed all these fish. In addition, I noticed more beer cans in the water and algae in greater quantities, and I thought, we are wasting the planet." And it was then that I got my first idea for Apotheosis. So he was inspired for this music by just visually seeing what was going on around him. And he later said that perhaps the topic was a little too intense or a little too deep for a commemorative piece such as this, but it ended up working out just fine. This work has been called a manifest against pollution and destruction. There are actually 3 versions of this piece, interestingly enough. The first one, composed in 1970 for concert band, in a time where new music for band was highly valued. Prior to around the 1950s, most wind bands played transcriptions, arrangements of orchestral works, and with few newly composed works available for bands themselves. Through Professor Ravelli's help and Frederick Fennell at the Eastman School of Music, the band became its own genre, and composers right around the 70s started to write newly composed music for that medium. Husa's first version featured spoken recitation parts for all ensemble members, including the percussion section, to be performed in the third movement. In other words, they were asked to speak or sing rather than play their instruments. This was very experimental at a time when things like this were not unexpected, but yet it was also hard to get willing participation for such a new and different technique. The work was completed in October of 1970, and the premiere was planned for January of the next year, but it was postponed until later that spring to be performed on Ravelli's last concert. Some of the reasons for that delay include the length of the work, again at about 27 minutes, the massive sounds that it requires, as well as those spoken parts in the third movement, and this all necessitated more rehearsals for the band that was to perform the piece. And here's what I mean by recitation. I'll click over to the document camera here in a second. It might help a little bit, but the phrase, "this beautiful earth," you might have caught that in some of the program notes that I read earlier. This is what the musicians are asked to do. They are asked to, each different instrument section or even by part, is asked to pronounce syllables of that phrase. Not the entire phrase, not just yet until the end. Some get the word "this," some get "beau," "ti," and "full," and then "earth." And you can see even from where you're at, the notation of the rhythms of the syllables, and you have to keep enunciating the ending of each word. And if you were a musician in 1970 and you opened up your part and saw that you were going to speak or sing in a band piece, what is this nonsense? So it took a little extra time and explanation for what was to happen. In the performance note that Husa included in the score, he says the syllables and later the full words are to be spoken mechanically at first. The sound should be comparable to that of a computer-like or electronic instrument. So he's looking for something very deadpan, no emotion in it at first until much later. The syllables are heard first, and they can be unclear because they compete with the texture of notes that other instruments are playing and holding through their instruments. Multiple syllables are performed at once in several sections of the ensemble. Down here we've got some percussionists that are pronouncing "this," and then a little further up in the flutes and in some of the double reeds we distribute "beau" and "ti" and "full" and "earth" throughout the rest of the ensemble. So this phrase isn't even being spoken or enunciated so that you can actually hear what's going on. You just hear these syllables, and it's a very striking experience once you first hear it. The word beautiful actually ends up being emphasized much later on. It fits into a rhythm that's already presented in several of the other instruments. From experience, even 21st century musicians took some time to warm up to the idea of speaking in rhythm. Band musicians are not accustomed to singing or speaking, even in 2014, 2015. So I want to play a little clip of what this sounds like once it's done. And this. Almost hear the S at the end of this, almost as a whisper, and it's hard to hear some of the other syllables. So I'm going to play that just one more time. It just sort of floats over the held, sustained sounds of the rest of the ensemble. This is in the third movement. Chattering of upper woodwind instruments after that one little presentation. In the original version, the only use of recitation was in that third movement. And so you went through the first movement, the second movement, and then suddenly we have all this recitation or enunciation of syllables. And towards the end, it comes together finally where everyone enunciates together. This beautiful earth. It's very moving and very striking. But the way he presents it at first was challenging for the 1970 musicians, and I can guarantee you, from my experience, it was just as challenging for 2014 musicians who had never done anything like that before. So the 1970 version, band all by itself. Then he has two other transcriptions or arrangements that he did himself for particular reasons, and the second iteration of this work happened in 1972. He transcribed the band parts for orchestra and added choral parts into all three movements. It became an orchestral and choral version because a new museum at Cornell wanted a piece of his for a grand opening, but only in 2 months' time. And he said he couldn't produce anything new in that amount of time. And the expectation was for a professional orchestra. So he transcribed the band parts for orchestral instruments. But since he found that the band musicians seemed uncomfortable with those spoken parts, he felt that when making the orchestral arrangement, he was pretty certain that the professional orchestral musicians might also resist performing those parts. So he decided a separate chorus of actual singers might be more willing and more effective in performing the spoken parts. But the third movement is only 6 minutes long. So in order to justify bringing in an entire choir, he decided to compose new choral parts in the first two movements as well. And he felt that this would create a complete musical experience for both the players and the audience. And so in addition to those repeated syllables in the third movement, he added vocal material derived from the wind and percussion parts in the first and second movements as well. He makes the voices imitate instrumental effects, glissandos, accentuation of important motivic material through vowel sounds, not even necessarily on particular pitches, but more oohing and ahhing and even some screaming. He added rhythmic and percussion effects through hissing and hand clapping and foot stomping. So I want to show you, I can't show and play at the same time, but I want to show you what some of this looks like. 4 vocal parts, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, and they are enunciating vowel sounds. And the men are glissandoing, scooping up from pitch to pitch. The women are holding their notes. The men continue to do those glissando effects. And then he even writes into the score, nearly screaming, as they change to a new syllable. Then he asks the men to laugh, almost a cackle. And this is another issue of his music where they all do it at their own speed. Repeat as necessary, the score tells us. A little later, they trill or roll their R's, almost like an instrumental flutter tongue. Then they start to clap. Here they have some rhythms to clap. They add. It's very layered effect. We add more rhythms. The clapping gets faster and stronger until it's just an obliteration of sound. And then, in one of the most dramatic moments, they shout, kill, murder, murderer. They stomp their feet. And again with the cackling laughter. So these effects go on, measure after measure after measure. He even notates in the score, inhuman, satanic, cynical laughing. He's looking for a specific effect. And then we get part of the question, why? 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 And it fades away. This is the end of the second movement. So with that knowledge, let's listen to that.
When you bundle
But first, let's watch Flow.
renters with your Progressive Auto, you save on both. And you can get renters for as low as $7 more a month. Cat food is more expensive than that, right, Karel? He's an eater.
Okay. So to introduce those kinds of sound effects and those kinds of vocal effects into an orchestral work at the time when things of this nature hadn't really been done a whole lot before, at least in the orchestral world, it was quite striking and really had quite an effect on audiences in the early 70s. But you can probably imagine why schools and bands and orchestras would be hesitant to program such a work for its difficulty, as well as for its subject matter and its sort of dark, deep subject as well. I think it's great. I didn't think it was great at first, but I think it's great now. In 1990, he combined the original concert band version with choral parts for the reason that the piece was brought back to his mind when he was in Czechoslovakia for the first time since he left in early 1990. And he conducted music for Prague after the fall of the communist regime. It's the first time he had been back. And he traveled north of Prague and saw the area around the biggest European uranium mine. And he said for 100 kilometers around the mine, there's not a single leaf on a tree, just dead black poles sticking up in the air. So he saw what was happening clear across the globe, and it reminded him of his original intent for writing the piece. The ecological concerns that he saw in 1970 in the United States were present in 1990 across the globe, and the work remained relevant for him. He wanted the same experience with full chorus for the band musicians as for the orchestral musicians in 1970. For my doctoral lecture recital, I conducted the original version with the University of Houston Wind Ensemble. Someday, I'd like to be able to do the full orchestral version or the concert band version at some point in my life. Some of the other tricks that he uses that I just want to point out that make the work a little more challenging are some of his unmetered or timed sections that are known as aleatoric music or chance music. You can see just from the contour of the way that the notes are placed on the staff that one section of instruments, in this case, for example, this is the entire trumpet section, 6 players, they don't all start at the same time. They start one eighth note, one small division after one another, and they play at their own speed. So same thing here in the clarinets. They start together on that downbeat, but then they're allowed and requested to play at their own speed. So it gives you that chattering, free-flowing feel to it, while other notes are being sustained, and the percussion section is going pretty crazy down there as well. So this is an effect and a technique that the composer used quite regularly, and it was somewhat unfamiliar to band and orchestra musicians at the time. Now we don't think much of it. It's kind of an interesting effect and fun to play. And he also asks for specific sound effects from his musicians. For example, quarter tones. Quarter tones, as he writes in the score notes, they're indicated by arrows pointing up or arrows pointing down for the pitch to be bent from its center. The arrows are valid only for the notes immediately following unless that note is tied across the bar line. So this gives the effect of the musicians being somewhat out of tune with one another. And this effect shows itself immediately from the beginning of the piece. And I would like to play some of that for you. I want you to think about how challenging this would be for one musician sitting next to another and not being able and not being encouraged to play in tune and to match pitch with them. Instead, they're being asked to play just ever so slightly out of tune with one another for an effect. It's quite challenging.
For a limited time at Chili's, mix and match fajitas come with free bottomless chips and salsa. Fill the fajitas with your fresh mix favorites and let the free chips and salsa flow.
I don't even let you skip it anymore. effect goes on for quite some time, where it's just so unsettling and notes are coming in and coming out and just sounding so out of tune, but purposefully. And that's a challenge to teach young or old musicians who are so used to blending their sound and matching pitch with others, and now you're asking them to purposefully play and not match their neighbor, and it can be quite challenging. The composer asks different instruments to play with a vibrato or a vibration in their tone that don't usually do that. Clarinets, for example, always play what we call a straight tone. In the score, he indicates a vibrato by a wiggly line above those clarinet notes, and they're actually asked to manipulate their tone in waves. It's not a technique that clarinet players usually do, and so that takes some training. So there are so many different effects, these are only a few of them, that would make it challenging, if not almost out of the question, for school bands to perform, although some of the best ones do still work at this piece, both high school and, of course, at the university level. And finally, when he layers in many of these individual performance effects, it looks somewhat like this. Just looks to be a smattering of notes all over. And there's really no one to rely on. The person sitting next to you is not playing what you are playing. And so the challenges of this piece just become more and more apparent the more you flip through the score. There are so many staggered entrances and even things that are timed by the clock. There are certain clips in here, sections of the score that the conductor conducts for 6 seconds and then moves on to the next capsule for 4 seconds. And the musicians repeat whatever they have in that capsule until the next cue is given. It gives it a very chattering, unorganized sound, but the music is meant to reflect the destruction of the planet, the events that are leading up to that destruction, and this is the way that the composer has indicated those problems and those issues. It's something really exciting to work on. My document comes up with ways, I have come up with ways to explain these techniques and to show them to the ensemble while going through the performance. And so a big part of my document is the performance guide. And I've got that pretty much under lock. I just have to get some more words onto paper and get my thoughts organized. But I think what's even more exciting is to make note of the works in which Husa uses similar techniques in the rest of his catalog. As it turns out, many of his other works have a sort of a nature focus to them, whether it's about Cayuga Lake 20 years later, or other looks at parts of the earth, both thematically and actually with the notes that he writes. And so this is where I feel like my document might have some larger implications for teaching this music and relating it to students and to things that are going on today. So the question is Apotheosis of this Earth still relevant today? And my answer is yes, it is. It's relevant as far as teaching new and exciting music to students of all ages and having them learn some of these special effects that they wouldn't otherwise get in other works. But it also has relevant connections to the relatively new field of ecomusicology or eco-criticism. Is that a familiar term to anyone? Anyone heard that? It's the study of music, culture, and nature in all the complexities of those terms. Ecomusicology considers both musical and sonic issues, textural and performative, related to the ecology and the natural environment. Ecomusicologists might look at materials used to make instruments and to make music accessories like woodwind reeds. And is it sustainable? Are we going to run out of bamboo cane in the next however many years for all those clarinet saxophone reeds that we have to make for those little beginner band kids? And should we, and then so some companies have come up with what we call fiber cane reeds. It's a substance. It's not regular bamboo cane. It's supposed to be more long lasting, so they don't have to keep buying reeds and breaking them every week. There are studies of acoustic ecology and soundscape studies, noise pollution, hearing loss, that all relates to music, all relates to ecomusicology. There's a subfield called biomusic, that deals with non-human sound worlds, the sounds of birds, whale songs, the implications of whale songs. We've heard some about that more recently. In terms of the larger field of musicology, this subfield of ecomusicology or eco-criticism seems to be pretty small right now, and it has a lot of implications for the long term by combining science and ecology and global cultures and history with all things music. I think it's fascinating. You don't even really have to play the piece to learn from it, first of all. Earth Day began in 1970, and the piece was composed in 1970 and premiered in 1971. I don't believe, from what I've read and researched, that Professor Husa had any connection with the first Earth Day movement, but it's pretty interesting that both of these events, this piece and that event, happened in exactly the same year. I think it's really exciting to make those connections. What does apotheosis even mean? Read that word? It's a great SAT word. It means the elevation or the glorification of something. And so in his title, he's referencing how much we should care about the planet, and how much at least he cares about the planet. I think that this topic is useful with a variety of ages and lessons and disciplines. What about having a film class use that music as a soundtrack and make a little short film? What about having an interpretive dance made up to a live or recorded performance? What if we take apart Husa's descriptive program note for each movement, referring to the tragic moments in the global context and the brutalities of man against nature, specifically by radioactive explosion, which was a concern in the 1970s as well as today. He asked the question, why did we let it happen in 1970? And we're still letting it happen in 2015 and knowingly doing it. And even the debate over climate change, whichever side you come down on over it, as well as environmental pollution and sustainability, it doesn't have to be political. We can observe what science tells us. It's not necessarily to be extreme about it, but I think that it should be a concern. And so here's where I need your help. I believe that apotheosis and things like it and pieces like it can be used as a foundation for a lesson in the sciences or in history or politics or ideological studies or you name it. And by foundation, I mean just that. Study the music, study the composer, study the inspiration and the implications, and relate the non-music information in ways that reflect both the disciplines. The Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, the TEKS for music, that are the requirements of primary and secondary schools in the state of Texas, state that by experiencing musical periods and styles, students will understand the relevance of music to history, culture, and the world, including the relationship of music to other disciplines. The student is expected to evaluate the relevance of music to societies and cultures, define the relationships between music content and concepts, and other academic disciplines. See where I'm going with this? And the Council of Arts Accrediting Associations defines and encourages multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and collaborative studies. And that board is covers the Accrediting Association for Music, as well as art, dance, theater, and it recognizes the importance of collaborating across disciplines. And so I'm asking you, as my colleagues, what connections could be drawn with this music or other programmatic music to specific lessons that are being taught in your disciplines? So I've given you a little questionnaire. You are not, of course, required to do it, but I would love to have your feedback of, has this sparked any ideas for you about using a piece such as this to enhance a lesson or to build a foundation on a lesson in your discipline? I came up with a list that I'll click through that might further spark your imagination of programmatic music compositions that relate to things such as nationalism, whether it's American type music with Aaron Copland and his Billy the Kid and Rodeo and Appalachian Spring that glorify the Old West, Wild West, to Jean Sibelius and Bender Smetana, who were nationalists on their own in their own countries, and even Antonin Dvorak, who traveled and worked here in the quote-unquote New World and composed his Ninth Symphony as a tribute to the music that he heard and his impressions of America when he traveled here, as well as American composer William Grant Still, with his two of his important symphonies, the Afro-American Symphony and Song of New Race. So there are implications of nationalism within music that can be applied to other disciplines. Obviously, there's a lot of emphasis on poetry and other literature in music, whether it's dramatic poems by Byron or poems by Victor Hugo, and even a more recently composed wind band piece, The Hound of Heaven, after Francis Thompson's poem. And if you don't know that poem, I had to look it up myself, but it depicts God as a loyal hound chasing after a lost soul who's depicted as a little wild rabbit. And in the several movements of the piece, the rabbit keeps trying to run away from fate, as it will. So it's a very interesting poem and a very interesting, relatively new wind band work. So poetry, literature, many composers have made connections with Shakespeare. We can see lots of Shakespeare titles up here. Many composers have taken on Romeo and Juliet, as well as Dante's works. There's a very new piece by the contemporary composer John Mackey. It's called Wine Dark Sea. It's based on Homer's Odyssey, and it was just recently premiered actually last year at our state music convention. And it's a very interesting musical depiction of that story. So there are many ways to connect with poetry and literature through music. Obviously, art. We may know of Mussorgsky's pictures in an exhibition that represents an art gallery, as well as one that I wasn't aware of, the Battle of the Huns that Franz Liszt did, based on a fresco of a battle with Attila the Hun. That was kind of interesting. Nature is another great topic, and that's kind of where Apotheosis falls in. There's The Planets by Holst, if you're doing a lesson on astrology, astronomy, Messiaen, the Catalog of Birds, as well as a look at the natural beauty of the U.S. with our canyons. Ralph Vaughan Williams, who's another nationalist, but wrote a work about the South Pole expedition, and it was actually from a film score that he did for a movie about the Antarctic expedition. And then, of course, history of all kinds. I mentioned that Husa was inspired by the Prague Spring, and he uses a Hussite hymn in music for Prague. Beethoven did some historical looks. We could also throw Tchaikovsky 1812 in there. And then if we wanted to go into more contemporary, non-classical art music, we could talk jazz. Ellington's Harlem Air Shaft is a musical depiction of an apartment building, a square of apartment buildings in the Harlem neighborhood, and all the sounds that are heard coming out of those open windows through the center column of the building, which is known as the air shaft. That was the inspiration for his work. And so, if anyone has any wonderful ideas that have sprung to mind, I would love to hear them, or I would love to read them for other ways that music and the rest of our disciplines can work hand in hand in collaborative lessons, even using musical works as the basis for the lesson, not necessarily as a side piece. I think that works such as Apotheosis would be a great springboard, even for an instructor who is not necessarily a trained musician, but could get the basic information about the piece, about the composer, about the inspiration, present it to the class, and allow that to open the lesson for discussion about the historical ramifications, the ecological, the science, the mathematic implications, in just a little bit different way than opening up the history book and going through the timeline. I think every once in a while presenting topics in a new way with some new connection to make is something that I always try to do when I teach music literature to our field of study students, or even the history of rock and roll class that I teach as well. Try to always bring in new ideas that will appeal to some student that's sitting there that might click with them in a new and different way. So I'm dying to hear what you guys have to say, if anything, and if you give me permission, I would love to include some of your suggestions in a section of my document that will hopefully help make Apotheosis come back into the repertoire for more bands to perform. So that's where I'm at with my document. I'm hoping that over Christmas break, the writing bug will strike me, and I can get a lot of it done and do my defense sometime in the early spring. and be done with it, and be Dr. Cristina in May. So really keep your fingers and toes crossed that that happens. Do we have any
Thank you.
questions? Comments?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Have you seen anyone who influenced him or he influenced somebody after him? Because his composition sounds like the sci-fi music. So anywhere have you seen anything that was the influence that somebody influenced him?
Sure, he's he's not teaching anymore, but he's fortunately still living, and he was teaching composition at Cornell as well as at the college. And I can't say that I can think of any specific composers right off the top of my head, but that's a really good. I'm glad you mentioned that because I can find a timeline. Many of our composers studied with other famous composers, and you can find that timeline. And so I think that's a good direction I'd like to go in, see where he came from and who came from him. Now he was influenced by, as I mentioned, Nadia Boulanger and Arthur Honegger, who also had some of those new and different ideas as far as composing. But thank you for the idea.
So did you say that this piece is already pretty well known amongst advanced band directors?
I'd say it's well known, but it's still not often programmed. It's known in conjunction with music for prog. Pretty much every high-level band and conductor has programmed music for prog, and it's often used in all-state bands so that many students get an opportunity to play it that may not be able to play it at home. But in all-state honor ensembles, it's often programmed. People just don't take that step to go on 2 years later to Apotheosis. Obviously for some of the reasons that you heard and saw, and also for the content. It's pretty heavy. Not that music for prog isn't heavy, but it's more melodic. One of the other things is that you just can't walk out singing a tune from Apotheosis. At least when you listen to prog, you hear that Hussite hymn because he gives it to you so many times. Bum, 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 bum. And it's almost like in a Gregorian chant style when it's first introduced. And you can, by the time you've heard the piece, it's given to you so many times, you can walk out at least remembering how it goes. Not so with Apotheosis. There's really no overarching tune that catches your ear.
When you mentioned those fields like literature, art, history, I was expecting to see politics in there, like storytelling of compositions of Shostakovich and Mahler, those.
Great.
Have you thought about that?
Not specifically, but I will.
Do they relate at all? Because my knowledge of music is very limited. Do they composition of Shostakovich that tells the stories of the time
Sure.
fits the storytelling of Husa, does it?
I would have to look into that more, but there are several of our major composers that either their music has been co-opted by political figures such as Wagner's music, and even Shostakovich had some issues with the Soviets, and so some of the composers were conscripted to write certain things to make the audiences feel a certain way politically. So thank you for that as well.
This is for Habib.
Yes, ma'am.
As a mathematician, when you look at those scores or you're hearing the music, how does that kind of connect?
I didn't think about it mathematically, but I don't know what to say because Cristina, I listened to the first movement completely. As soon as I saw your name on the list, I didn't know who Husa is. So I went and listened to one movement on that list. And to me, it came up very stark. It just, but looking at the score of the composition, I don't know. It just hodgepodge to me. It just.
And that's the challenge, is that it is so free flowing, and much of it is left to chance, as opposed to other compositions we might be familiar with that are much more organized and controlled by the composer. This is much more left to chance. And so there are other implications, I suppose, for mathematical chance as well.
Question, as a non-musician, what goes into a complete conductor's performance guide for a piece? And I was struck by your use of the word document. you mean that is the document that the conductors will have, or is that your word for dissertation? Are these two pieces of writing?
Document is sort of synonymous for me with my dissertation. I'm creating a document that will be a conductor's guide. Whether the conductor references the entire dissertation or portions of it to find out how to approach a particular rhythm or a particular sound effect that the composer asks for. But my complete conductor's guide is going to include addressing the instrumentation of the work. It calls for a very large ensemble with lots of extra instruments that most bands don't have sitting around. And even at U of H, we had to do some substitutions. And so I'm giving suggestions for how to approach the music in a variety of ways. How to teach, as I mentioned, certain challenging rhythms, how to teach certain sound effects that the musicians might not be familiar with. I'm also going to include some suggestions for enhanced performance. When I did my lecture recital, we actually projected on the screen behind the ensemble a picture of the Earth from space. And it started as a little bitty dot. And over the 27 minutes, essentially it came into focus 27 minutes, and then at the peak moment in the last movement, you could see the Earth filling up the entire screen behind the ensemble in the Moores Opera House. And so there are some suggestions for amplifying the chorus if one was to use the chorus with a band, or to use even a pre-recorded chorus and a conductor's what we call a click track, meaning that you hear a metronome clicking the tempo through an earpiece, and you can play back the pre-recorded chorus if you didn't have the forces to tackle the chorus with the band or the chorus with an orchestra. Now, I'm not sure what Dr. Husa will think of all that, and I hope to be able to ask him. But in the age of technology, if the music is to be performed, we need to look for alternative ways to get over those road bumps of not having, a chorus that can handle the challenge of oohing and ahhing and clapping and stomping, but you have an orchestra or a band that wants to tackle the piece. So
this may be way off base.
Please.
No music background whatsoever, but I'm trying to being an Earth guy. Picturing this Earth getting closer and closer through the 27 minutes. If the theme of this piece is destruction of the Earth, with the technology we have now with Google Satellite, you could approach the Earth as a beautiful, wondrous sphere, which it looks like from space. But as you get closer and closer with Google Maps now, you can come down and you can find some of these areas of strip mines and pollution sites. And basically, you could go from this beautiful picture of kind of the way the Earth should ideally look, and then when you get past that, almost what seems like a facade now, based on what we've done to the planet, you get closer and closer and recognize that really underneath it all, it's a mess. And Google Satellite and stuff would zero in right on all that sort of stuff.
brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
So great.
Also, when I was listening to some of the excerpts, art history is my thing, and I immediately thought of Hieronymus Bosch. And, Hieronymus it's the one he has in museum in Madrid. Hieronymus of Dante's Hell. Yeah.
Earthly
Yeah,
delights.
Earthly Delights, yes.
Heaven and hell.
That hit me, what beautiful music that would be when you're looking at that picture. That would just be amazing to me.
I love it. It's exactly what I wanted.
Is,
Please.
no, and another word that came to me when I heard part of it, and I don't mean to insult, it was cacophony.
Yes. Yes, that's what he was going for. Just
Who
that.
got it?
Yeah.
Very intriguing though, not off-putting, just different.
Good. I know that even when I did my lecture recital, I received many compliments for the scope of the work, but there was always a but, or there was often a but I don't think I liked it. Okay, fine. You know, you did a great job, the piece was interesting, but I wouldn't want to listen to it again. Heard those things a lot. It's fine. It's all good.
What was critical reception at the time in the 70s? Like, what was written about it? And mostly, well, how wild it is and how avant-garde it is.
Mm-hmm. There were a lot of comments about the content and the requirements of the ensemble, and even Professor Ravelli did not think that the piece would be a success. And he even knew of, obviously he knew Husa, he knew of music for prop, but despite that, it did receive many performances, 80 or so within the first 2 years, just because I think it was so new and so different, and people wanted to give it a try. And then, you know, then it kind of fizzled. And so I want it to re-fizzle.
The magic of the piece is training lay people as to what it took to perform it and to write it down, so that you understand it.
Yeah, I mean, my score, you saw my markings on my score, there's just, I've got sticky notes and arrows and, you know, red marks, and it's just kind of holding on for dear life. For the music people, there are so many mild tempo changes within one movement. Music is measured in beats per minute, and there are whole lists on the internet of rock songs, pop songs that correspond to those beats per minute. And so at one point I've got the title of one of my favorite songs by Duran Duran, so I can get the tempo right away, and then it goes to Walk This Way by Aerosmith, because it just bumps up by like 10 beats per minute. And so in performance, so I can get it right, I just wrote in my song cues and flip to a couple words, and there's the tempo. And that was suggested to me by my teacher. I think it's brilliant.
Well, thank you, Cristina.
Thank you guys for coming. If you have any suggestions for me, I'll gladly take them on the papers, and if not, that's fine too.
Go see him quickly.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. I know.
Yeah.